Mark, maybe you could just start off by saying what you've been up to.
Sure. So I kind of have an interesting perspective on it because I was a large company CMO, so Honeywell Aerospace. I've been a chief commercial officer. I've also been a chief communications officer. These are all like HP type companies. I about 20 years ago had this existential crisis working for Mark Hurd at HP, who was very into accountability, and he kind of had he was very customer facing, so he had a better idea of marketing's value than I did. So I started on this pilgrimage, and that's really the way it's felt, right? To really learn and become extremely fluent in data science and in finance, because that seemed to me to be the only way forward for me. And I'll freely confess, doing it initially out of a search for significance kind of thing, right? It was very ego driven. Later it became much less so. So today I sit kind of in a very interesting three circles. Like on a daily basis, I interact with CEOs and CFOs in the Global 2000. I interact with chief data officers and people like that in the same kinds of companies. And I interact with marketers. I am kind of the alter ego no matter where I go, because everyone tends to, it's just a natural human characteristic, to adhere to their own perspectives rather rigidly, right? So I think in the not nicest possible way, I've been called the occasional bomb thrower in some of these conversations, right? I tend to challenge a lot, but I try and do it very constructively. I created a company about 5 or 6 years ago called Proof Analytics, which took everything that we had learned in B2B about stitching together all the investments that we were making against certain outcomes, net of time lag, net of externalities, right? And to do that at Honeywell, for example, we had to spend $8 or $9 million a year essentially on data scientists. And the main issue was to get the scalability that we needed around the world and to reduce the latency on the recalc of the models. So it was a brute force solution, but you didn't have to be brilliant to figure out that there weren't too many companies like Honeywell that are willing to spend that kind of money on that, right? And so automation, so I come out of the software space mainly, automation was like a no-brainer. And so we built a software platform, SaaS platform, that significantly automated aspects of this whole thing while still keeping human beings very involved, data scientists and business leaders very involved. Highly collaborative. So there's a lot of kind of like sociological aspects to the relationship between data science and business, and that are profound. The people process technology is profoundly scalene, and so if you don't address the people part, you're kind of screwed on everything else. So that brought me to the point where I am today. So I'm writing a book right now, which does not yet have a formal title, but the working title is essentially go-to-market of the future, the CMO of the future, all that kind of stuff, and the not too distant future is what that really means. And it's very balanced, but it is written primarily from the perspective of the business. So I've interviewed about 300 of these Fortune 1000 leaders. Kind of had an early choice. I could either have radical transparency, from these guys, but anonymous, or mostly anonymous, or I could have them on the record and they would obviously scale their comments back. I've sort of done a mix, because as an author you need a mix, but a lot of times I opted for the radical transparency bit. So what you get is a really, really, really interesting portrait, psychologically, practically, and a lot of other ways, right? About the current state of the relationship between primarily B2B marketers, but we also, as a point of contrast, I've spoken with a lot of leaders in B2C, because they tell largely a different tale about their marketers, right? So that's kind of what, that's a longish version of the answer.
Practice, he's actually really done some interesting sourcing, not just talking to marketers, but also to CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, and the like, which is I think very important. So one of the things that whenever I'm going to start off with some questions, and I want you guys to come up with more, but just to get things going, is one thing that I keep hearing from Mark is that CEOs are frustrated with marketing, and the intensity of their frustration is growing, right?
Maybe even exploding.
Yeah. Why?
That's a really great question, and I think that you definitely have to say that it's a different situation in B2B versus B2C, right? B2B has, I think it's fair to say, and I hardly ever use this word, but has never had a strong intellectual basis for what it does. It has largely responded to investor pressure, particularly VCs, but it's not limited to VCs. It's been a more is more, always, 100% of the time. It's been completely uncalibrated in almost every way. On both the cost side and the value side, it's just been floating free, right? This has been the case to varying degrees, right, as long as I have been in the business. I mean, I remember as on the agency side when I first started out, tremendous frustration from clients, you know, and you'd hear it kind of filter down through your account soup, you know, all the way down to you as a junior AE or an AE or whatever, right? And it was always kind of thought of as part of the cost of doing business. Today, one of the things that I have found very striking in the interviews that I've done is the vehemence, the outright anger, the personal offense that is on display. You get it to some significant degree from CEOs, you really get it from the CFO. CFO is personally offended by the way that marketing runs itself. The fact that they're always over budget. I mean, these are sort of, they're so true that they've almost gone into a different level, right, of trueness. But they're always over budget. They never communicate until the last minute that they're going to be significantly over budget. They have become past masters at hiding money, at turning agencies into their bank, all kinds of stuff that just gives finance major heartburn, right? It's kind of like the way that a lot of them analogize it. This is actually an extremely common analogy in these interviews. It's like having a spouse that doesn't know how to keep a checkbook. And you're like, no, it's, you write a check and you write it in the register, right? And at the end of every month, you put it out, you reconcile it, it's done, right? They just, go crazy about that, right? The fact that I had one CEO that said, we were earlier in the interview, we'd been talking about a definition of brand as being the psychographic definition of brand, which is awareness, confidence, and trust that your audience gives you at any given moment, right? And so then I don't know, half an hour later, because these are a lot of times pretty lengthy interviews. He's like, going back to that, he goes, I'm going to explain how I feel this way. He said, he goes, I have great confidence that my CRO is going to deliver his number. I have no trust at all in how he will do it. Okay? Which I thought was very illuminating. Okay? On my CMO, I have great trust that she will always do what's right for the business, that she will never want to take any unnecessary risks, harm the business in some way, cause a scandal in the business. I mean, we were talking about the beer thing earlier. But I have no confidence at all in marketing's ability to understand why they're doing what they're doing, to prove it out, to calibrate it, to pivot appropriately as circumstances change. He goes, they don't even know how to write a business case, right? So like, seriously, teach your students how to write a business case, right? It's like a big deal, particularly going forward. So, I mean, that's they're pretty bent. They really are, and they're taking a lot of very interesting steps. It started in earnest about 4 months ago, fairly unilaterally, so which means that there's going to be a lot of not so great stuff happen as a result of this, right? It's a revolution. I mean, they openly talk about it sometimes as a revolution. And so being a revolution is going to be messy. And there's going to be blood on the floor, and it's not going to be pleasant for a lot of people. And it's not unique to marketing either. To give you a sense of just how ecumenical this is, right? Same thing is going on with data science departments. So for the past 5 to 7 years, data science teams have spent millions of dollars and all their time building data management systems of unrivaled complexity, largely as a result of the cultural bias inherent in that profession. So then the economy went to hell, right, about a year ago, and all the business leaders turned around to their data scientists and said, hey, things are really changing, really need some analytical output to be able to understand what's going on and make better decisions. And what they got back was, well, we're not there yet. We're still building the supply chain part of all this. And they're kind of like, the hell you say, right? So what is happening right now is very similar to what happened 20 years ago with IT teams after Y2K. They're all being moved over underneath finance, not because finance necessarily wants to teach them anything about data science, but because they believe that the only way to change the culture of data science is to expose them to a new level of rigor, right? And so it's happening a lot, and everyone feels like, again, it's very human, their function is at the center of this maelstrom, and that they're being unfairly picked on. It's actually not that way.
Do you have any hypothesis on what these rather irate CFOs might start doing? like what, have they given any clues to what actions they might take, whether for better or worse.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of runs all over the place a little bit. I'm aware of 3 CFOs who, so they didn't fire the CMO, right? Someone else did, okay? But marketing for the next 9 to 12 months reports into the CFO at these companies. Again, not because the CFO believes he or she can add anything about the practice of marketing. It's about a reacculturation of the organization, right?
Are those all B2B examples?
Yeah, because, honestly, I mean, there's exceptions. There's tons of exceptions on both sides. But if you look at B2C, what you see, particularly in large CPG, retail, companies like that, right? The marketers control all 4 Ps, which is something you do not see in B2B, right? And never have, and probably, at least for the foreseeable future, probably won't ever, right? A lot of product level marketing leadership in these companies actually owns the P&L. So why is that? How is that enabled? Okay, well, they spend a ton of money on research, which B2B doesn't do. They spend a ton of money on analytics, particularly marketing mix modeling and stuff like that, right? Which B2B hasn't done. It's not to say that any of this is like perfect, because I don't think that there is such a thing as that. But there is an intellectual rigor, a mathematical, analytical rigor in those companies that you just don't, in the marketing teams of those companies, that you don't typically find in B2B. I mean, the likelihood that a B2B CEO would give P&L responsibility to his CMO is so low that I'm not even sure how to calculate that, right? I mean, is it possible? Sure, it is possible. Probable? Not even remotely, right? And if you look at, I mean, not to be mean or anything, but if you look at, again, the intellectual basis for a lot of what goes on in B2B marketing, it's not there. It's just not. Yeah.
In Germany, we have the tradition of being involved very much with industry. And so one question is, I think marketing always suffers at the board level if you do not own sales. So if you have a chief sales officer, you're basically doomed because you're responsible for the fluffy part, right? Communication, not even distribution, because like especially in B2B, sales is very strong. And if you have like a CMO patch to this, you cannot actually win, right? So because you do not own the pricing, the value generation, you do not own services. So I think that's a structural problem at many B2B companies. And that could be part of the problem that you get back. So because they never owned it, they could never prove. And you're the first to get in trouble because you're like for the fluffy part, right? And easy to cut because there are no numbers. That's my first question. I don't know.
Yeah, so I think that the key here is if your organizational alignment is based on some sort of ad hoc agreement between the parties, okay, then it's only as good as the parties, and it's very fragile. If, however, you take analytics as the basis, the single source of truth, not just siloed data, but analytics is about the relationships amongst data sets, right? What you see is the truth which is, particularly in B2B, marketing is a nonlinear multiplier of linear business functions like sales. So it is a point of leverage that, so you could say that, for example, marketing's mission is to help sales sell more product to more customers, that would be revenue impact, faster, that's cash flow impact, and more profitably, that's obvious what that is, than sales could do by itself, right? And so the value of marketing then really becomes the extent of that multiplier effect. And when you don't have any basis of understanding that multiplier effect, then you have no value. Then that is then thrown, that is complicated immeasurably, but not, it's not something that analytics can't deal with. But that is complicated immeasurably by time lag, which in B2B can be really significant. So, I don't know, 5 years or so ago, we did a project, I kind of have to tiptoe through this very carefully. We did a project that looked at 5 companies, that B2B companies that had just fired their CMOs. And the mission was, were any of these justified? In other words, to what degree were the investments paying off? We used a common basket of data types across these 5 companies. The net is that 4 out of the 5 should not pay. And it was mainly the time lag issue was the major obscuring factor.
That's a very good point. So marketing investments, except for price, are long-term, right? So the impact is dynamic.
Long-term being a relative statement.
Relative, like 6 months. It's beyond the quarter.
Yeah, it's asynchronous with sales.
Yes.
Yes.
And so you actually, I think marketing's core problem is that we have delayed impact, so it's dynamic, it's nonlinear, and it's stochastic. That's why I love modeling.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, that's where the fun comes from. Uncertainty, dynamics, nonlinearity, right? And one example, and that may be catering to your story, is 2 of the largest brands in the soap market hired me simultaneously for the same job. And I told them, hey, I'm with the other, but they said like, no. And the funny thing is...
But we have this conflict agency that we can...
Well, I was transparent, so here we go. And you know who hired me was in both cases the CFO.
Yeah.
And the controlling person of that CFO. Because marketing had its models, data science, with 50 variables. And so they said, hey, we want output to guide our decisions, but basically it's all over the place. So I actually came in, and the only thing I did is I established, instead of one model, I said, like, you have a pricing model, you have an advertising model. So I made it simple, cut it down to size.
Yep.
Left managers wiggle room because it's incomplete, we still need the human, right? So within 4 weeks, you just cut it down and have like a model with 3 variables, like price and promotion stuff, by product, by category, and you tell the data scientists who have no idea about this marketing modeling stuff, by the way, so no domain knowledge, but you actually break it down into a simple version, and they live happy thereafter. It's just like, as you said, this complexity is not what they need. What they need is direction.
Well, and it's honestly, and this would go for all 3, right? This would go for the marketers, the business leaders, and the analysts, right? They are mutually illiterate in the other areas, other domains, right? So, like, one of the things that I end up having, that we, not just me, end up having to do with customer business leaders is show them how to take output from the tool and make better decisions with it, because they are actually astonishingly, like, they have, to the point where a lot of them have allergies to, psychological allergies to a graph. They can deal with charts pretty well, okay? But graphs, just, there's something about that, right? I personally think we're now seeing the culmination of 50 or 60 years of really bad math education in this country, right? But there's more to it than that, right? So yeah, I mean, I think, my dad was a triple engineer and a CEO who had a rather scathing view of marketers. Like, I started doing proof several years before he passed away. He was so thrilled. He was so thrilled that I had come back to the right side of the river, so to speak, right? Yeah, no kidding. But he had this theory, okay, that a lot of marketers went into marketing because they felt stupid in high school math or college math courses.
It's true.
It is.
Okay, which is probably true to some degree. I don't think it's by any means the only reason why people do anything, right? But I don't really believe in singularity from a causal perspective. But yeah, I mean, that, I think that it's a problem.
Mark, I have a question.
Yeah.
Something that you said caught my attention. You said that.
Sorry?
Something that you said caught my attention. You said that the key difference between B2B and B2C is the lack of analytical rigor in math.
Yeah.
So do you think bringing the two into B2B will fix the problem?
It is.
Go ahead.
I would like to say it is.
Yeah.
And I'll cover that this afternoon when I present, but it is really changing the view. Like, when you're talking about the cross illiteracy, you need a common layer that everybody has contributed
So
to.
my question, my
to make
bigger
it happen.
question is, are you saying that bringing in analytics and math, data science in a broader level, is the key solution to fixing the CMO problem?
I think that if you accept, which I think is a pretty commonly accepted view, right? That technology, let's call math a technology for a second, okay? That technology is never a single silver bullet, right, on anything. So again, we're back to that fact that the people process technology triangle is really scalene. So you can't just say, well, we're going to programmatically and technologically implement all these analytics, right, and not deal with the human being, right? Part of that dealing with the human being piece is educating them. It's remedial knowledge transfer, okay? Part of it is also helping them deal with the psychological fear associated. So they see, a lot of people see analytics as a judge in black robes, okay? When they should be seeing it as a coach and a bodyguard, okay? The bodyguard piece is you took a risk, it was a calculated risk, and the analytics is going to prove you right, if you're actually correct.
So I think the point is that it's not just technology, but it's technology plus humans.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. This is where parenthetically, I think that we're talking of, the whole thing, which is not a new fear at all, but the fear of all this AI is going to replace us as human beings, or a very sizable percentage of us is just not accurate, right? And if you have spent any time with LLMs, for example, they are amazing in many respects, but not always in a great way, right? I have as avocationally, I'm a pretty devoted scholar of 15th century innovation, Italy versus Southern Germany, right? Just kind of my thing. And so I had an LLM. I put the prompts in to write a academic style research paper, fully footnoted, all that stuff, right? On a particular, rather arcane aspect of this, but where there was a lot of material out on the internet. What came back in about 4 minutes was perfectly laid out. And if you knew nothing about the topic, you'd say, wow, this actually sounds pretty good, right? If you know anything about the topic, it had huge holes in it, which was then made worse by the fact that a lot of the attribution, meaning the footnoting, was fictitious. It had freaking made it up, right? So if you're not merging human wisdom and experience with AI, you got a big problem. Mathematically, it's also just the LLMs anyway are a joke. I mean, they cannot they can't even identify prime numbers with any accuracy, right? So I mean, it's just So I think there's always this people piece. It has to be there. Yeah.
Mark, I have a question, because you mentioned previously you've done a lot of these interviews. There's a great study that came out several years ago about CFOs exiting the IR and reporting function and becoming more forward-looking, strategic. Do they have a different lens on this topic? I don't know how much you've had a chance to.
Yeah, I mean, so they are very, I think that the more uncertain and volatile things get, right, it is the natural human tendency to want to try and look further down the road and around corners and all this kind of stuff. So they've actually, for a long time, because I was part of earnings calls in a lot of these companies a lot, right? Guidance is huge. Your ability to then live up to the guidance is even bigger. So this has been a thing. It's not a new thing at all. It is definitely intensified. And it's gone, if you'll allow me to use this phrase, it's gone down market, so to speak, inside of these companies, or more accurately, it is in the process of going down market in these companies. I was really blessed in my time at Honeywell, because Honeywell had a 5-year strategic plan with annual operating plan updates, which is essentially what they do for earnings, but writ much larger, right? And to participate, you had to do a formal business case, including all kinds of forecasting work. In fact, the math and all that kind of stuff was a much bigger part of these reports, these business cases, than how eloquently you could wax on about whatever it was, right? So there was a level of discipline there that was unlike anything I had ever encountered in big tech. Big tech, by comparison, is so loose, it's just like staggering how loose, right? But that is starting to change. It really is, right? So again, I always hesitate to do this because it makes it sound like there's some sort of silver bullet here, and it's more than one thing always. But if you had to kind of pick something that was a symbol of where things are going. It's the business case, the real business case. And if you can't do that, you're very unlikely to get funded. More and more what I hear also on both sides of this equation is that rather than, so for like the last, 4 years, the COVID years, it became very fashionable to ask like CMO or senior marketing candidates to write a strategy and, a go-to-market plan and all this kind of stuff, largely for free as part of the interview process, right? It was very controversial. The way that is morphing now is write a business case. Like if we hire you, you're essentially proposing a level of funding for marketing or go to market, and how are you going to use it and all this kind of stuff, and what's it going to mean, right? So it's actually, I personally think, by the way, that if you ask somebody to do that kind of work in an interview situation, you ought to pay them something. It might be relatively nominal, but they should be paid. I think that's just an ethical thing. But I think that is real life, and that's going to only be more and more and more intense, particularly if the volatility of the economy persists. Because one of the things that everyone's most freaked out about is the volatility, the lack of dependability, and so to someone was saying earlier, right, about the fact that finance is taking over a lot of this stuff, right? They are. We see it. We've, on our software, we've sold it into the CMO buying center for years now. In the last year, we have seen finance come as a rapidly rising economic buyer of our product. And they basically have come to the conclusion that they're tired of waiting for marketing to get its act together, to acquire the skills and the perspective, and I'm now really speaking about B2B, right? And so guess what? We're just gonna step in, and for some period of time anyway, we're gonna do this, right? And we're gonna collaborate with marketing, but it's not going to be peer-to-peer, right? There's going to be a first among equals relationship, and finance is it. So, I mean, it's I think decidedly imperfect, but I totally get why it's happening. I mean, to be perfectly candid, and I know that there's going to be a lot of marketers here to say this, they're just really not going to like this, okay? But they've had years to wrap their head around this and get with the program. And the way business leaders feel is that marketers ignored them, stiff-armed them, made excuses, whatever, right? And so now there's just kind of like this, I mean, seriously, one of the hallmarks of these interviews is an extraordinary amount of profanity applied to marketers. Like, it's really quite good that some of these I can't identify at all, can't even identify what company or anything, because some of these marketing teams, if they heard their CEO or CFO talk about them in the way that they did, right? My effing marketing team, okay? I mean, holy cow, right? I mean, that's some pretty heavy stuff. So, but it's true.
Can I add something slightly different?
Sure.
Which is that I think that for some very good reasons, you are maybe from marketing's perspective looking at B2C companies, rose-tinted spectacles, because my experience is that in most CPG companies, the P&Ls are not in the hands of marketers, right? They are in the hands of finance and operations oriented, sometimes sales oriented, business people, not marketers. And if you look at P&G, for example, the people running with the name of brand franchise leader in P&G, they are career P&G operatives. They are not marketers. I did an awful lot of work on marketing organizations some years ago with Jim Stengel and Mark Pritchard. We evolved finance from the beginning, which was the only reason we got anything to happen, by the way. But they, at that time, it was pure career P&G people running the brands. And each of them said, they weren't interested in the brand. They had a dog food brand, they weren't they? And they wanted to know why they weren't doing as well as the competitors and began to benchmark them and discovered that there wasn't one person in the executive leadership who had a dog or cat. That changed after this. But what we ended up doing was pairing the business leaders running P&Ls with people who didn't go on after 2 years to their next career up the P&G ladder, but actually stayed in the brand and were more marketing minded, and that made a big difference. But it's true in Mondelez, it's true in Kellogg, it's true in P&G, they're not run by marketers. But they are, you're right about them being more, data-centric. But it's not because they're run by data-centric marketers, it's because they're not run by marketers.
I want to build on what you just mentioned, said there, because I think this is a very critical point. You look at a typical organization, the amount of finance people that are there is a fraction of the marketing people. And if you look at the title structure and the accountability structure, you go and call it a whole ecosystem around marketing operations. You have a whole system around channel marketing, right? In CPG, you'd have the equivalent through retail marketing, right? Like how you go and collaborate with partners. So I think part of what I'm kind of hearing in this discussion as well is again going to that cross-pollination. People are not understanding what these people do, and I think marketing is too broad a term for a chief marketing officer.
And particularly if we look at increasingly the way that CEOs are looking at this, it's go-to-market.
Yeah, it's
the whole suite, right? And then they're really on the horns of this dilemma because they're not they have figured out, okay, that they cannot put their CROs in charge of the whole thing. Because the CROs will ruin marketing faster than almost anything else, right? They also realize that in many cases they can't put their CMO in charge because CMO's never carried a bag, doesn't really know the customers except at arm's length, right? Is got a whole different set of issues, right? So then they're kind of like trying to figure out how they coordinate this, right? And there's kind of like a headless model where the head, if you will, is really analytics that promotes the alignment. And then there's a more traditional model, which is, well, we're going to find, you call it chief growth officer, you could call it whatever you want to call it, right? But that person is going to have two main direct reports, marketing and sales.
Yeah, we have 2 more minutes.
Yeah, maybe one comment like that. My experience is, as marketer, you have to be crystal clear in the communication of the revenue generation and margin generation model. So you say like we have a couple of variables like pricing, like distribution, right? They may be in different hands, Right. But they all need to play together, and I'm the one telling you how they fit together to produce sales, right? And what I see with CMOs struggling is, they talk about the latest Instagram, whatever kind of technical fad, instead of the basics.
No, I mean, I agree with you on that.
And CFOs clearly understand, if you say, look, am I wrong? This is like the sales generation model.
But I think that most B2B CMOs, though,
Yeah,
don't understand how their business actually makes money.
exactly.
Okay.
And that's part of the problem.
And so asking them to specify how it all fits together is going to be a problem.
Yeah, but the CMO should be able.
CMO, though, is not.
Yeah, and then rightly so, they not take it seriously, because like you need to understand how your firm from supply chain, like because supply chain feeds into margin. And so if you produce more sales and you overstress the supply chain, you're in trouble. I mean, you have to have this sales generation model and the awareness what goes into it.
So one other thing, though, because I know we're short on time, that I really want to mention here that's so important is that there's a rapidly growing awareness among CEOs and CFOs and the C-suite more broadly that they're a huge part of the dysfunction. That they cannot just say, all those marketers over there, right, they're the problem, or those sales guys, they're the problem, right? Well, we can just start with positional power. That right there, because I'm not aware of a CEO that reports to a CMO. Okay, so that right there means that they already have more than 50% of the responsibility for the dysfunction. It can, depending on what happens after that, it can be as high as 80%. These are rough numbers. If they are not, so what I've said in several of these interviews, because these interviews kind of have an interesting component to them where we almost end up having some sidebar conversations where I'm giving them help, right? And I'm like, look, here's the deal. Bottom line is, if you're not happy with the way that it's working, if you don't feel like you have enough transparency, if you don't have enough awareness, confidence, and trust in these teams, if you don't, however you want to define it, if you're not happy and you're not stepping into it and saying, we're going to sit down and we're going to hammer this out, we're going to redefine the game that we're playing, how points are scored, what fouls look like, we're going to, use analytics, we're going to do all this kind of stuff, right? If you're not doing that, then I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for you. Some of these leaders really responded to that message, and other ones didn't like it too much. It's okay, right? But I mean, it doesn't change the fact that at the end of the day, business is the denominator, and that is never going to change. In the numerator-denominator relationship, business is always the denominator. And at the end of the day, marketing is going, just like data science, just like a lot of these other functions, marketing is going to have to change to meet the needs of the business. There's only one strategy. It's a business strategy. There is no such thing as a functional strategy. The functions exist to operationalize the business strategy in their particular area. That sounds pedantic to make that point, but it's actually something that they drive home at Honeywell and other companies like Honeywell over and over and over again. You, as the CMO or the CTO or the CIO, you do not get to have your own strategy. You are implementing in your area the business strategy. That's what the 5-year strap is all about. So I think because marketers, I certainly was one for a long, long time. I know how it feels. Totally sucks. To be beat up over and over and over and over again, right? Where's your value? you overspend, whatever, right? And all that's true. I mean, so you can't just say it's not true, and, oh, that's mean, and it's unfair, and all the stuff that's typically thrown up on the board by marketers. But it is also true that business has participated very significantly, even dominantly, in the dysfunction that exists.
I think that's a wonderful way to end it. There will be much more to come. I think this illustrates why this marketing organization and demonstrating the economic value of investment in marketing initiatives are so critical.
Absolutely.
And absolutely, so thank you very much.
My pleasure.
It was a fascinating beginning.